KVM if we have time from Robert, whatever you can talk about. Even if you can just talk about it a little. I know
I
you
can
talked
talk about it
before.
a little. I can't make it. I'm having issues at the moment. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I'll be happy to meet the week. If there's time for it down there, we can definitely schedule it for a later one if that works out better or something like that, because I know a lot of people have said that they were looking forward to seeing that one. So, however it works out. But I think that's all I have to report. But yeah, I can send something out when I get home tonight on there just to verify. But yeah, but next week I'll probably do it. So what everybody wants, it doesn't matter to me.
Okay. So
Saratoga's just kind of nice because everybody knows where it's at on there, but that's really the only real benefit that it has.
okay, so it looks like we're getting quite a series of talks about virtualization. So over to Nate this time to talk about Solaris zones.
Alright, so up here. I have to give my presentation from a Windows machine because BISMAN allows one operating system and 2 antivirus softwares through their VPN. Okay, so Solaris zones. I stole Colin's with his permission after the fact. Kind of his layout. Just kind of took what he had for his notes and then kind of followed the same format. Hopefully that'll help for comparison's sake, and then for those of you who saw last time. So we've got the virtualization, and what is virtualization? I think a lot of you guys are pretty familiar with that, but it's just a little history. I've been working with Solaris for only about a year now, but zones are more of a lightweight virtualization concept, and they're developed, we were talking at dinner tonight, off the idea of BSD jails, which were added to FreeBSD in 1999, and then Solaris, Andrew Tucker at Sun kind of took that, and according to Sun, they have a lot better security and are better integrated with the OS. But personally, I've never worked with the jails and BSD. So most people in casual conversation don't distinguish between Solaris containers and Solaris zones. But just to clear the air on that, the official definition from Solaris 10 is that a container is a Solaris zone with resource management features. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to use the term zones. So Solaris zones is operating system level virtualization. I know Colin talked about Zen, which was para-virtualization, which would be more similar to Solaris LDOMs, which actually use the hypervisor for hardware allocation. To talk for the zones, or for the LDOMs to talk to the hardware. Solaris zones are available in Solaris 10 as well as the Nevada release of Open Solaris, and the guest environments are referred to as non-global zones. So you'll hear that term tonight, and they all share the same host of OS, so there's only one kernel running. The idea of a zone is that it creates more of an isolated process tree, so the processes don't affect other processes that are outside of that. So that's why they're usually referred to as lightweight virtual machines, because there's so little overhead behind them. Kind of in our series here, the virtualization products that are available. We've seen the presentation from Colin. I'll do Solaris zones, and then hopefully Robert and John will follow up with that. But since Solaris zones are operating system level virtualization, they can be installed on any system that supports Solaris 10, be that x86 version of Solaris or Spark, or any platform you can install Solaris 10. You can work with zones. The mini virtualization, the use of virtualization. I'll make this this presentation or all these notes are public, so I'll give you guys a link so you can read up on that if you want to. But some of the pros and cons, I just made a quick list here. I have no proof, but I've read that Solaris zones have the smallest overhead among many of the mainstream virtualization technologies, kind of because of what I mentioned earlier with its single operating system, single kernel running. It's pretty clean and simple design. Of course, it's supported by Sun Microsystems. Quick and easy setup and configuration. You'll see that a little bit later. I'll show you guys a little bit of how to set up zones, how to change resource allocation, things like that. It's operating system level virtualization, so hardware support. And one nice feature that's come about in Update 5 Solaris, it's been in the open Solaris for a while now, is it supports CPU and memory capping. So rather than allocating a certain number of CPUs all the time, you can just cap the number of CPUs that a zone can take up. So allows you to be a little more flexible with your resources on your computer or your server, and that you can just put a cap on the memory and number of CPUs. It supports live migration, moving a running system from one system to another. I haven't actually done that yet, but I've read a little bit about it, and supposedly it's supposed to be work pretty well. So, a couple negatives: the ability to monitor the resource on a monitor, things like how much memory your zone is taking up, how much CPU it's utilizing from within the zone is somewhat limited. Even from the global zone, there's better tools for that. You can see a little bit more. But if you were selling this, as BTI wants to sell Solaris zones as a virtual server product for kind of a lower end server, the customers will only have access to the zone itself. So they are pretty limited on what they can see as far as their resource utilization. And I'll show you some of that as well. And then you're also limited to either native Solaris, which you can run in your zone, or they've got something they call branded zones. The most popular of the branded zones is an LX zone, which is for Linux and allows you to run Linux binaries. It's not actually a full install of Red Hat or a Linux distribution. It's a branded version of the Solaris zone where you can run Linux applications. Global and non-global zone. Global zone is primary OS. So you have your global zone, which is just an install of Solaris 10, and the features available in any install of Solaris 10 or Open Solaris, the Nevada release. So that OS is started, of course, when you boot the computer, and then you set your zones, whether or not you want them to boot on startup or not. You can create as many non-global zones as the system resources will allow. You don't have to assign a CPU or any memory to a zone. So if there's, you don't have to cap it or anything. So if you can boot it, you have enough memory and CPU to boot the zone, you can run it on there. There's no limitation as far as that goes. There's two main types of zones. There's whole root zones, which contain basically a complete replica of the host OS file system. So those end up being about 3 gigs or so. But you can have sparse root zones that can be as small as 150 megabytes. Basically what they do is they will inherit the file systems from the global zone or that host OS. Then I've got a link here, just a Solaris how-to guide for future reference. Those of you who take a look at this later. So I've got just some quick kind of tutorials here. A quick list of commands is all really it is to how to create whole zones. And basically what I've been working with mostly is whole root zones. I haven't worked a whole lot with sparse zones because we kind of keep them self-contained. If you have a sparse root zone, you inherit certain file systems from the global OS. You may need to install apps in the global OS in order to be able to use them in your zones. So I've got a couple connections open to a couple servers at BTI here, if they're still open. Okay. I'll show you a little bit, just walking through how to create a whole zone. The install actually takes a little while, so I probably won't go through the entire thing, but I can show you at least kind of how quick it is to set up a zone. And this is a whole root zone, so you've got two main commands. You've got zone config, you got zone ADM. Zone name will tell you the name of your zone. I'm in the global zone right now. I'm just going to zone config, and then the zone name you want to create. I do have a couple of zones on here already. Just test zones that I'm messing around with. So I'll set up another one, and that's zone 1. Oh, I better come to it first. I use a Sun keyboard at work, and the caps lock and control keys are extra. Gets me every time. Okay, so you do have to have permission to write to the to the drive that you're going to install. That's one about Solaris zones. You can install them at any partition on the global zone. So any directory location. If you have SAN connectivity or however you want to do that, it doesn't care. Just any local accessible file system. Okay, so the first thing it's going to tell me that there is no zone 1 configured yet. This is the first time I configured it, so I'm going to create it. I'm going to set my zone path, which reminds me, I don't know if I've created that yet. That's kind of the standard locations, export zones. You don't have to name the path the same as your zone. Name whatever you want. Set auto boot. I think I'm going to go ahead and just set that to false, but of course as a production system you would probably want to set that to true. Unless you want to boot, start them all manually after you boot the global zone. So then you add your net and set the address. I think this is available IPs. Then you set your physical. So now when you set physical here, this is the name of the physical interface. It isn't the name of the virtual interface that's going to be created. So in Solaris it'll be, on this particular box, the E1000 G0, or it could be BGE0. But when you create, when you're using shared IP or shared interface, and you create a virtual IP or set up a virtual IP on there, it's going to call it, G0:1 or :2, similar to Linux and or Red Hat anyway. And but just keep in mind that this is the physical interface, and notice that I didn't set up this IP beforehand. The zone creation will do that for you. And then you add your net. Excuse me. One step. You end that. So I was in the net config, and kind of notice how it jumps back when I hit end. And this is the step where you decide if you're going to set up a sparse root zone or a whole root zone. So by default, these are the directories that your zone is going to inherit. And say if you don't want your zone to inherit all of these directories, or maybe you want just one of them, maybe you want to customize this, or you want to add some, you can do that. So what I'm going to do is just remove these. So I'm going to remove them. Okay, so if I run that command again, that is just look for the info. Any command you can run that info on, and it'll tell you what's currently set. So I get nothing back. So I've got everything removed. And then you want to verify your configuration. And if it comes back with nothing, it's a good sign. Commit that, and then you can exit. And then you simply run a zone ADM. Zone name, and you install it. And that's going to start installing your zone. You can actually do that. It's going to create a list of copies to file, or files to copy from the global zone, and then it creates that entirely separate file system in that directory location. After that, you just boot the zone with somebody get mad at me doing that, but booting the zone is zone ADM-Z zone name rather than install. You type boot, and then there's a Z login command where you can actually -C allows you to log into the console of the zone, and that's where you would get your your sys unconfig just initial setup, right, time zone, and set the IP address and gateway and all that good stuff. So that's how you. That's just basically how to create a zone. The next step I've got here is resource allocation and monitoring. Resource allocation, I mentioned capped CPUs and a number of CPUs. When you're in the configuration, you can add, say, capped CPU and just set your number of CPUs to 4 or however many threads that you have. This particular server has 24 threads, so it's as simple as that. Data cap. Cap memory is the same way, except you set your physical and set your swap. I'm just going back to my notes here so you can kind of see that. So I'm going to type it on there, but just your CPU utilization. You can cap that, or your memory, set your physical, set your swap. 4G, 4 gig, capital M would be megs. Or you can assign a CPU range. Now, the cap CPU feature just came out in Solaris Update 5, which just came out within the last month, I believe. Before that, I was using Open Solaris, the Nevada release, and it was already in there, so I was able to use that right away. But hadn't really at that time started playing around with zones. But so the dedicated CPU is where you can actually set the number of CPUs. It's going to allocate that number of CPUs. You can set the importance level so that if you over allocate the number of CPUs that you have to your zones, and you set the importance, higher or lower, if it runs out of available CPUs, it will look at that importance level and give the zones, the higher priority zone or the higher importance zone, the CPU. There is a service that needs to be running. It uses the pool daemon in the assigned CPU range, and something I actually just found out this week when I was playing around with this. This capped CPU, when it comes to monitoring how many CPUs are being used, this pool stat command, there's kind of two. This particular machine has two fairly busy mail servers. One's outgoing and filtering, and the other one's an SPOP server. But Control C with this. You'll see that MS07 has 4 CPUs assigned to it. It's only using about 0.03 of what's allocated. That CPU and the load's at 0.04, so not very much. Especially this time of the day, these aren't very busy. But MS06 has 12 CPUs, 12 threads allocated, using 1.11 and 1.36. So this is kind of how you can look at your zones that you have set up from the global zone and figure out how busy they are, how many CPUs you have allocated. But this pool stat command, with the capped CPU, it doesn't actually create pools. So on this other box here, I've got a couple test machines on here, and I've capped the CPU. If I look at info, let's see, This is this MSI MSO4. It was going to be a mail server for one of our customers, and I capped the CPUs at 2, capped the memory at 512 megs. But if I do a pool stat here, all I see is the global. So I haven't figured out yet with the capped CPU method how you're supposed to be able to tell how many CPUs are or how much is being used by that box, other than looking at top on the individual machine. And you can see the load average is pertinent to the local machine. But that's the other thing. When you're within a zone and looking at top, load average is for that zone, specific to that zone. But if you look at the memory allocate or the memory usage, that's the entire server. Amount of memory being used in the entire server, and also the percentage of the CPU being used is for the entire server. So it's a little tough sometimes to gauge how much the zone's actually using. You have the load average, and that's about, there's not a whole lot else you could go by. Another command here is this rcap stat, and this shows you the memory capping going on. You can see that mail server 06 is capped at 4 gigs, and 07 is also capped at 4 gigs. But when it starts this cap enforcement threshold, we start to see percentage points over here. It's starting to have to enforce that cap that you've set, and it'll actually limit the box from doing anything else. And you'll start to just get ran into that before. We're setting up a server, and when you try to start up more services, it's kind of the same thing that would happen if you had a box that was just running out of memory. It's going to tell you you don't have any memory, virtual memory is low, or you can't. You'll just get all kinds of random errors when you start doing that. And you look on the global zone, and you'll see it starting to cap, and the virtual memory is just pegging this cap. So that's fairly useful if you're trying to figure out how much your zone is using. And from within a zone, let's see if I can.
It doesn't differentiate virtual memory from real memory. Like you can't give it like a page, like some swap or something like that.
Yeah, you can't you can't allocate like with the CPUs as far as assigning a certain number. Yeah, you can cap memory, but you can't say you have 512 no matter what, or you have so
you're going to have to basically allocate it as much memory, the maximum amount of memory you expect it to use, because once it gets to that, it's going to
start running errors. Yep. Yeah, and then so you want to cap that relatively high, and hope that a bunch of your zones don't need all the memory at the same time. And I guess they'll just slow down and they'll just wait for available memory. But I haven't had a chance to totally max out a box yet. Especially we're running up these on these Sun blades, and they're 8 gigs of memory and 24 cores. It's kind of hard to max them out. But this guy with this mail server, he's runs a couple 150 some domains and 4 times that email addresses, and just gets hammered by this filtering server. And so that's why we've got 12 threads allocated to that, and 4 gigs of memory, and it's just running postfix and dovecot and then clam antivirus and spam assassin for filtering. But
do you normally have the same number of threads as you do processors? Can you have more threads than real processors?
In physical processors, yeah, because these blades have. You're talking about the hardware itself. Yeah, these blades have one physical. It's a 1 gig hard, but they have 24 threads, 24 core in that. And they're Sun hardware, Sun blades. But
so could you say 48 threads?
In this machine?
In your
allocation.
Oh, you can allocate. Yeah, you can. I remember I was trying to think back when I tested that. You can allocate as many as you want, whether they're there or not. So you can allocate 48, and it'll use what it can. Yep. So, good question. What else we got here? So those are kind of the monitoring commands that I've found. I've really been trying to find more to be able to just analyze what your zones are using as far as resources, and there's just not a whole lot out there. I mean, you've got your standard, I mean, you have top and you have stat and biostat, and you look at your global zone for that stuff, but as far as what each zone is using, it's kind of tough to tell sometimes.
When you run, say, can you look at processes in child zones from the global zone?
Yep, if you, well, even if I run top, I guess, the number of processes is, this is all the processes that are running on your box.
Including the ones inside of zones?
Yeah. Yep. But if you look at top inside of a zone, it's going to give you the number of processes that are running in that zone.
Right.
But the CPU line here and this memory line is going to be the same from inside a zone and from the global zone, pretty zone. The load average is, this is for the whole box in the global zone, but that's going to, if you're inside a zone, it's going to give you the load average for that zone.
So if you have 20 processes in a thread, you're saying that it's going to say 20, you're counting the processes within the thread. And you're 247, I think that's what I heard you say. At 247, that it's not, if you have 24 threads and then multiply that by the number of processes within the thread, that's not what that's counting, is it?
Right, this adds, this would be adding up everything on all the threads.
When you do like a PS though, you're not going to see those processes because they're not real processes.
All the, all 236?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no different than, yeah, top on any machine, I suppose, you know. I'll just do PSS, yeah.
So if you count those, how many does that count to be?
We're counting
256.
and 249.
Depends which PS you run. If you run System 5 PS, then system, maybe it's different now, but in Solaris 8 and Solaris 9, System 5 PS did not show you lightweight processes running. So things like if you ran OpenOffice or something like that, you would see one process in PS, System 5 PS, but if you ran the BSD version, which is in /USR/ I can't remember where it is. If you run that one, then you can actually see all the lightweight processes running.
That's quite a bit different than what you were showing, right? It didn't seem to work that way.
No, they were completely separate.
Completely separate. There, you
Yeah.
just couldn't. Yeah, I mean, they are what they are. Until you got into them, you never would see any of that.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the fact that you actually, with zones, you actually have one kernel which is managing everything, then it means that once the kernel has to start doing anonymous paging, it's going to anonymous page anything that it can find. It doesn't care which zone it's running in. Same with, say, process management and things like that. When you start a new process in the child zone, the global zone will set up the process and hand it back to the child zone and say, that's yours. So, which is why you get these interesting statistics when you start trying to work out what's going on, because you only have one processor that's dealing with everything.
See all these SPAMD and FlamAV, these are all running in MSO 6. You see them all in the global zone here.
That also kind of relates to what you were saying about it not having very much overhead. You know, I mean, it's wrapped
really
in
all
with a
right on
pretty
the same
thin layer. If you can really see it like this, it's,
Yeah. Not much separation, really.
yeah.
Have you ever had to do any patch management for zones?
I have read, and you are supposed to be able to either patch the zones individually, a global zone separately, or you can patch the global zone and run that, patch every zone that you have if you want to do it that way. I have ran into when I was testing just, and that's more so it depends on what you inherit, but you install software and if you reboot your zone, that software will be available in your your zone, but that's more when you're dealing with sparse width zones and depending on what you inherit and things like that. But yeah, patch management is one thing. They kind of tout that, like if you're running a bunch of machines that are, a bunch of virtual servers and they're all yours that you're managing, and you want to update patches on all of them, you can run that patch on the global zone and it's going to patch but it'll go through and you'll see it, it'll patch one zone, patch the next zone, patch the next zone. That's it. So it takes more time, but it doesn't, especially if you're running whole road zones, it has to run that patch on every zone. Zone recovery. This is just more for disaster recovery. If you lose your machine entirely or lose your file system, you can create the zone just using the steps earlier. Restore the entire root. I should show you one of the directories. So this is where 06 mail server is installed. You'll see root, dev, lost and found. So everything contained in that zone you can get to just through the file system here. So this root directory, essentially, you just restore that from backup into the directory you created your new zone. And then you boot and log into that restored zone, and that's really all there is to restoring from a backup. Fairly simple there.
Does that mean that they all boot the same? In theory, they're running all the same kernel.
They are running all the same kernel.
So you couldn't run different
OS
kernels.
separately, no.
Okay, all right. That's okay.
Yeah. All one kernel. Also moving and cloning zones, just some quick steps on how to do that. Cloning a zone, I should actually do that for you. That's actually pretty quick. Maybe I'll do that over here instead of So I think I'll clone this mail test zone that I've got here. First thing I'm just going to do is just halt the zone and shut it down. You see how it has this is the process or the zone ID, I guess, that it assigns to it. So I've got that dash there. It's installed, but it's not running. This one's incomplete because I killed it during the install. So what I'm going to do real quick here is just configure the new zone. And maybe what I'll do is just actually maybe easier just to visible. Okay, so I just configured basic configuration of the zone. But I didn't install it yet. And I'm going to create zone 2, cloning from test. And that's what all it takes.
So that's copying basically your root directory across? Is that what the clone does?
It takes like the mail test zone is a whole root zone. So that when I created that replicated the global zones file system already for that. And so it's taking that and it's replicating it again into the new zone, and then applying whatever configuration you set for it.
But why would you want to inherit things like slash lib and this bin?
What I've found, I guess, when you're installing libraries and things, maybe it's more so from BTI standpoint. We're looking at selling zones, and we want to be able to tell customers that these are virtual servers, completely separate, and we don't want them to be dependent on the global zone, or if we change something in the global zone, we don't want to affect their VPSs, and probably more from that.
So you're going to have your own SBIN lib and such
you
to
can
meet
do
the
whatever.
needs of whatever you're going to run in that zone.
Yeah,
basically.
and if you want to change that, mess around with it, you can do that. Add to it, because one thing, a zone can't write to those locations either. So that's probably the biggest reason why BTI is. We basically just said that we're going to do only low red zones. Disk space isn't an issue. So that's just what we're going to do. So.
But then I guess if you were just running web server or something on there, then it would make sense to export as much as you can, because these people aren't going to be doing that kind of stuff. You just want to
you just need that. Yeah, you have a specific
execution environment.
Yeah, and you know exactly what you're going to use your zone for. Maybe you just you could create a couple 100 meg zone and run whatever you're going to do.
I could see that being a security concern. Why give them commands and library access to something that you don't want anybody to run in that zone?
Sure.
I see that as well.
Sure, that's a good point. Yep. Yeah, and then everything they would install on there, they would need to install in their own whatever directory you gave them. So you saw some of the tools. It was only ADM. I just did a couple of printouts here of the options there. Boot, reboot. You saw me listing the zones that were there. Install and uninstall, cloning. When you move a zone, they've got the detach and attach command. So essentially, you detach the zone, you move the file system or the directory wherever you want it, then you reattach it, and you can move zones from what I've used it for is moving zones from a test area or even a local file system onto SAN connectivity in a different directory on the server. Zone config, that's where you do all your configuration, your capping, allocating your resources, verifying your configuration. Just an example of the lists. Rule stat command, rcap stat. This tells you a little bit of what everything means in that rcap output. Total virtual memory size, the total resident set size of the zone. If you're not using zones, Solaris has this what they call project. I haven't worked that much, but it sounds like it's more of a, not only creating an entire zone to run your piece of software, and you can kind of contain it within a project and allocate resources to it that way, or just maybe put more separated, I think, from your file system that way. Network configuration. There are some things, if you set up, you're using a shared interface and you've got zones with different IPs on different networks, different subnets or VLANs, there are some things you have to do in the global zone to get that to route accordingly. Show you a little bit of what, kind of an example of that, I guess. First of all, your Etsy net masks. You have another. This is that same test server, but you've got your, what we've got at BTI is the host, or the global zone is on at 172, a private network. And then we've got zones that we're setting up are on a public network. So, so you set up net masks for both of the subnets that you want to use in the Etsy net mask. So that's probably the easiest thing to figure out. That's, you know, when I first started playing around with it, I thought, oh yeah, I do that, I'll be good to go. But it's not quite that simple. So you also got to set up your interface. And you look at the. So you take your hostname files and you rename them to. We've got a 242 VLAN and we've got a 43 VLAN. Just get all this on the screen here. That was the same number. So we've got VLAN 43 is global zones OS, so that gets its host name. And you set up the SPS custom 1 VLAN 42, and if you look at your host file, you're just giving that a 0 IP. So the global zone must have an interface on each VLAN, because everything for the zones, the zone traffic is actually routed over the loopback interface, and in order to get out, to find its way out, it has to go through the global zone, and that's where you set up these your netmax, and then the final thing you got to do is it has to be able to get out, so you have to add a route. So what we've been doing is adding that to RC3, and you just add your route. So you have to add your default route for that VLAN. And so your if config ends up looking kind of like this. Your routing table. You're gonna have two default routes. You're gonna have your private network here, your VLAN 43, and then this default is 242. And those are kind of essential because you've got two interfaces here that you're creating for each VLAN, and that's how what you have to do in order to route when you're using a single interface for all of your zones. You can also use what they call an exclusive IP scenario, where say you would use G1, you wanted to assign a VPS to or a zone to E1000 G1. What you would do then, when you configure your zone, you would set the net attribute. In the IP type, you would set to exclusive. And I've got this in the documentation if you do play around with it, but you set that to exclusive, and then the physical interface you set up as this E1000-242.0.0.0, and then you don't set the IP in the zone configuration until you boot the zone, and then it assigns that OS and creates that interface for you, creates an IP. So I don't know if that got a little confusing. If you guys have any questions?
So if it's not exclusive, then if the global zone can't route the traffic, then the zone won't be able to route the traffic.
Right. Yeah.
And then with the exclusive one, you're basically saying, like, here's a physical NIC, you can go grab it.
We'll use it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly. Thanks for summarizing. Yep.
So if you go, so with your first scenario there, if you actually went inside of the zone and did a look at the routing table, you just see one. How does that look?
Let's take a look at that. Look at that. And that's So this is what the routing table looks like on the zone. So it knows its gateway. It knows the router IP, but you can't get there without going through the global zone. And for the zone separation, you've got a bunch of zones on one subnet sharing interface. They can get to each other over that loopback interface. So since that traffic passes loopback interface, you can separate your zones using IP filters, and that's BTI's plan to separate VPSs that they're going to be selling. So that's currently what I'm working on learning is the IP filter rules and trying to test that and make sure that one zone can't get to another zone without going out first. Experiences. BTI currently has that one customer that I was showing you with. That's probably the best success story we have so far. They've got a Solaris 10 running on a Sunblade T6300. They've got those two mail server zones, and they're also going to be moving a couple of web servers over to that machine. So they haven't been in production on that blade for even an entire year yet. So it's still relatively new, but it's gonna save them some money because they're gonna take. But right now they've got 4 Sun V125s. They're all Solaris 9, but with a couple gigs each, and then they're going to consolidate 4 servers into one. And it's also a good thing for BTI, of course, because it's all about dollars per rack space. So consolidating is good, but so it works out good on both sides. And then BTI is also planning on offering hosted zones that basically the issue we had is that we don't have a lower end server. Our lowest end physical server is about $150 a month, I believe. And so we wanted to offer something for more of the $50, $100 a month range, just for people who want to get into a lower cost machine. So and we've had customers requesting it as well. So that's our plan is to start offering these whole root zones as virtual servers to customers as well. Although they will be fairly limited to, only certain services will be allowed in the firewall, and they'll be fairly restricted. We won't have a whole lot of flexibility, but they are less expensive too. So. Some of the other virtualization options, I know, kind of at dinner tonight, some of the guys were asking about. Solaris has a lot of different virtualization options out there. Not, Zones is really the only one I've worked with before, but the branded zones, like I mentioned earlier, allows you to run non-native applications on Solaris. So the first brand they've developed, and probably out of demand, I imagine, is the LX brand, and that's for intended, I guess, just kind of reading it, but it's intended for x86 applications, and it's supposed to run well in CentOS or Red Hat Linux 3, I guess is what I think they're basically supporting applications running on CentOS or Red Hat Linux 3. You're supposed to be able to run that in a branded Solaris zone and be able to run that as if you're running on Linux. So. And then LDOMs, logical domains, what that stands for. They've been around for quite a while, from what I understand. And that allows you to consolidate multiple physical servers into logical servers, and that way you can run a little more similar. It's more that parallel-virtualization, like Zen, where your guest OS makes calls to the hypervisor for other resources, and so you can run multiple operating systems on there. But from what I've read, LDOMs are only supported on Sun hardware. So.
And it's Enterprise 10,000, so not much thing, isn't it?
I don't know. Yeah, it's the cool threads. It's the cool threads.
All right.
Yeah, cool threads hardware line. And then the most recent thing that I've seen, they've really been advertising this, I guess, on Sun's website, is the XVM VirtualBox. And it looks like it's pretty cool. It's intended for developers, but you can run multiple operating systems on the same computer. It supports, well, you can run basically practically any x86 based OS in this virtual box, and the VirtualBox software can be installed on Solaris, Linux, Mac OS, or Windows. So they've got some screenshots. Looks pretty cool, but they do say it's intended more for developers so they can test their code on multiple platforms. Just some of the other virtualization technologies that they're offering, and these are all links. So when you guys take a look at the notes, you can check those out in more detail if you want. Also, Solaris they did open source Solaris. There's Open Solaris, and you can also download Solaris 10 for free if you want to. So I've used Open Solaris when I started with, and when they came out with Solaris 10 update 5, I went back to that, and more so because BTI has a contract with Sun for updates and support and things like that. So kind of made with Open Solaris, I couldn't get updates, but you kind of have all the updates out here, because that is, if you get the latest release, you're way ahead of the game. One of the funny things, I noticed that the capped CPU was available, and I went to a server that we had at work that was running Solaris 10 update 4. It did not have that available yet, and I was it's like, what? I've been playing around with this already. But of course I had Open Solaris, and so it was already there, but it wasn't available on any of our servers yet. So update 5 it is available. But, so that's kind of what I know about Solaris Zones. Like I said, I'll send this link out to the list as well, so you guys can take a look at that. And since we've got this on